diagnostic doctor who is very unusual, named Alice Stewart.
Right off the bat, I'm noticing that the speaker has sounds like an English or British accent. Although for the past 15 seconds that I have been watching her, I've been able to clearly understand what she is saying, but she may be using terminology that I'm unfamiliar with, or the way she says words could kind of throw me off a little bit if I was interpreting this. So that is something to keep in mind.
And Alice was unusual partly because, of course, she was a woman, which was pretty rare in the 1950s. And she was brilliant. She was one of the, at the time, the youngest fellow to be elected to the Royal College of Physicians. She was unusual too because she continued to work after she got married, after she had kids, and even after she got divorced and was a single parent, she continued her medical work. And she was unusual because she was really interested in a new science, the emerging field of epidemiology, the study of.
Okay, stopping it right there. Epidemiology, I have no idea what that means. It's a very long word and would be very tiring to constantly fingerspell that word as it comes up in this TED Talk.
Patterns in disease. But like every scientist, she appreciated that to make her work, what she needed to do was find a hard problem and solve it. The hard problem that Alice chose was the rising incidence of childhood cancers. Most disease is correlated with poverty, but in the case of childhood cancers, the children who were dying seemed mostly to come from affluent families. So what she wanted to know could explain this anomaly.
She's using big words like affluency and anomaly. Those are two words that I am unfamiliar with and would have to look up in a dictionary to be able to have message equivalency with signs. So being able to come up with synonyms that I know of and being able to portray that in sign language.
Now, Alice had trouble getting funding for her research. In the end, she got just £1,000 from the Lady Tata Memorial Prize, and that meant she knew she only had one shot at collecting her data.
She said that she only got £1,000. I'm not exactly sure what that equates to in US dollars. So if my client was curious about what the transaction for that is, I would have no idea. So maybe they're not familiar with pounds, so that's something also that I'd have to take in consideration. That could be very challenging.
Now, she had no idea what to look for. This really was a needle in a haystack sort of search. So she asked.
Needle in the haystack is an English idiom, and that would be kind of difficult to portray. You couldn't sign needle in a haystack because a deaf person might not understand that phrase. That it's like one in a million or very rare. So I would have to think of like what I just did, synonyms for that.
Everything she could think of. Had the children eaten boiled sweets? Had they consumed colored drinks? Had they eaten fish and chips? Did they have indoor or outdoor plumbing? What time of life had they started school? And when her carbon copied questionnaire started to come back, one thing and one thing only jumped out with a statistical clarity of a kind that most scientists could only dream of. By a rate of 2 to 1, the children who had died had had mothers who had been x-rayed when pregnant. Now that finding.
As you can tell, the speaker paused for dramatic effect. It's a very heart-wrenching statistic to hear. I know my heart kind of sank when I heard that. So being able to portray that same feeling to the deaf person is very important because this is what her whole presentation is about. So being able to capture that is important.
In the face of conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom held that everything was safe up to a point, a threshold. It flew in the face of conventional wisdom, which was huge enthusiasm for the cool new technology of that age, which was the X-ray machine.
I also do not know the sign for conventional, so that would be something I would need to look up to sign this effectively.
It flew in the face of doctors' idea of themselves her preliminary findings in the Lancet in 1956. People got very excited. There was talk of the Nobel Prize. And Alice really was in a big hurry to try to study all the cases of childhood cancer she could find before they disappeared. In fact, she need not have hurried.
That sentence, "she need not have hurried," is kind of difficult English sentence, so when I would hear that, I would definitely have to rework that to make it more clear for the deaf person and also for me too.
Fully 25 years before the British and American medical establishments abandoned the practice of X-raying pregnant women. The data was out there, it was open, it was freely available, but nobody wanted to know. A child a week was dying, but nothing changed. Openness alone can't drive change. So for 25 years, Alice Stewart had a very big fight on her hands. So how did she know that she was right? Well, she had a fantastic model for thinking. She worked with a statistician named George Neal, and George was pretty much everything.
Statistician, again, is another word that I would have to fingerspell. It's a long word, and it takes time to do that, so making sure that my pace and my listening skills and figuring out what's important and what's not important to be able to make sure I get the right information out and the most important information. Because this TED Talk is very quick, she's using a lot of big words, she's switching topics very rapidly, so it's very important to make sure you capture the essence of what the speaker's trying to say.
That Alice wasn't. So Alice was very outgoing and sociable, and George was a recluse. Alice was very warm, very empathetic with her patients. George frankly preferred numbers to people. But he said this fantastic thing about their working relationship. He said, "My job is to prove Dr. Stewart wrong." He actively sought disconfirmation, different ways of looking at her models, at her statistics, different ways of crunching the data in order to disprove her. He saw his job as creating conflict around her theories, because it was only by not being able to prove that she was wrong that George could give Alice the confidence she needed to know that she was right. It's a fantastic model of collaboration. Thinking partners who aren't echo chambers.
Echo chambers is another one, another phrase that would be kind of tricky to interpret that meaning. So that's another one that I would have to really think about. Synonyms and being able to convey concepts that the speaker was trying to.
I wonder how many of us have or dare to have such collaborators. Alice and George were very good at conflict. They saw it as thinking. So what does that kind of constructive conflict require? Well, first of all, it requires that we find people who are very different from ourselves. That means we have to resist the neurobiological drive, which means that we really prefer people mostly like ourselves. And it means we have to seek out people with different backgrounds, different disciplines, different ways of thinking, and different experience, and find ways to engage with them. That requires a lot of patience and a lot of energy. And the more I've thought about this, the more I think, really, that that's a kind of love. Because you simply won't commit that kind of energy and time if you don't really care. And it also means that we have to be prepared to change our minds. Alice's daughter told me that every time Alice went head to head with a fellow scientist, they made her think and think and think again. My mother, she said, my mother didn't enjoy a fight, but she was really good at it. So it's one thing to do that in a one-to-one relationship, But it strikes me that the biggest problems we face, many of the biggest disasters that we've experienced, mostly haven't come from individuals, they've come from organizations, some of them bigger than countries, many of them capable of affecting hundreds, thousands, even millions of lives. So how do organizations think? Well, for the most part, they don't. And that isn't because they don't want to. It's really because they can't. And they can't because the people inside of them are too afraid of conflict. In surveys of European and American executives, fully 85% of them acknowledged that they had issues or concerns at work that they were afraid to raise. Afraid of the conflict that that would provoke, afraid to get embroiled in arguments that they did not know how to manage and felt that they were bound to lose. 85% is a really big number. It means that organizations mostly can't do what George and Alice so triumphantly did.
Right now, the speaker is really trying to convey this statistic, this percentage, as a very significant part of this research, this collaboration of this team, also with like the company. So I think that it's really important that as an interpreter, I convey the importance by the tone of her voice. You know, she's very like exaggerating these things. And just making sure that, you know, I convey that with my facial expressions, with the usage of my signing, and how I sign it.
Can't think together. And it means that people like many of us who have run organizations and gone out of our way to try to find the very best people we can mostly fail to get the best out of them. So how do we develop the skills that we need? Because it does take skill and practice too. If we aren't going to be afraid of conflict, we have to see it as thinking, and then we have to get really good at it. So recently I worked with an executive named Joe, and Joe worked for a medical device company. And Joe was very worried about the device that he was working on. He thought that it was too complicated, and he thought that its complexity created margins of error that could really hurt people. He was afraid of doing damage to the patients he was trying to help. But when he looked around his organization, nobody else seemed to be at all worried. So he didn't really want to say anything. After all, maybe they knew something he didn't. Maybe he'd looked stupid. But he kept worrying about it. And he worried about it so much that he got to the point where he thought the only thing he could do was leave a job he loved. In the end, Joe and I found a way for him to raise his concerns. And what happened then is what almost always happens in this situation. It turned out everybody had exactly the same questions and doubts. So now Joe had allies. They could think together. And yes, there was a lot of conflict and debate and argument, but that allowed everyone around the table to be creative, to solve the problem, and to change the device. Joe was what a lot of people might think of as a whistleblower, except that like almost all whistleblowers, he wasn't a crank at all. He was
I'm not exactly sure what she meant by a whistleblower. I don't know if that's I'm sure that's an analogy for something, but I'm not familiar with that term. So, at this point, I'd probably fingerspell it, and if the deaf person had a question afterwards to ask the presenter, they could do so, but as the interpreter, I would not know what to sign for that except to fingerspell. So.
passionately devoted to the organization and the higher purposes that that organization served. But he had been so afraid of conflict until finally he became more afraid of the silence. And when he dared to speak, he discovered much more insight
So with TED Talks, there's a lot of rapid point changing. They usually have one overseeing goal for the TED Talk, but then there's multiple points that they make throughout the TED Talk that refers back to it at the end, which can be a challenge for interpreters to be able to make sure that they get all of the proper information for all of the points so that the overall concept makes sense. Um, which again, with TED Talks, with challenging topics and terminology and phrases, can be quite challenging. Another thing with this particular speaker, um, a lot of the points that she made, she paused so that the audience could process it and think about like how that sentence that she just said made them feel. And I think that's important for the interpretation as well. Even though that pause would give me time to catch up, I should really focus on making sure I add that pause for dramatic effect, or, um, you know, finish, pause, and then start my next thing so that the deaf person also gets that same effect that the speaker was conveying to the audience. So.